The complete story of Alexander the Great, the prodigy who conquered half the world from America. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back, far back, to a time when the world seemed impossibly large, but one young man decided it wasn't large enough. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, let your mind loosen its grip on the day, because tonight, we're following Alexander the Great, boy king, would-be god, and occasional reckless overachiever, on his long, glittering, and somewhat tragic march across half the known world. And no, he wasn't actually from America, despite what a few over-enthusiastic TikToks might suggest. But if he had been, he would have probably tried to conquer Canada by lunchtime. This is the story of brilliance and ego, of golden crowns and muddy boots. A life that began in privilege and ended in mystery, somewhere between fever and ambition. So let's begin. In the land of Macedonia. The birth of a conqueror, the year was 356 BCE. Macedonia was a wild northern kingdom, not quite Greek, not quite barbarian. The Greeks looked down on them, though that attitude would soon age about as well as milk in the sun. Alexander was born in Pella, the Macedonian capital. His father, King Philip II, was a warlord and a politician of the most tireless kind. A man who could charm you over dinner and have you assassinated before dessert. His mother, Olympias, was from Epirus, a proud and mystically inclined woman who reportedly kept snakes as pets, because of course she did. From the start, Alexander's family life was what you might call complicated. Philip was constantly at war, constantly marrying new women for alliances, and constantly irritating Olympias, who took her revenge in icy silence and the occasional curse. Alexander grew up in this boiling stew of power and paranoia, watching his father turn Macedonia into a disciplined military machine, and no doubt taking notes. He was clever, intense, and, according to the sources, strikingly handsome. Though ancient historians had a generous definition of handsome, he was also small, pale, and carried his head tilted slightly to one side, which gave him the look of someone permanently suspicious of the furniture. But what he lacked in physical presence, he made up for in willpower. Even as a child, he had the kind of ambition that could make seasoned generals feel suddenly inadequate. The education of a future god. When Alexander was 13, his father decided he needed a proper education, so naturally he hired Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the philosopher, the scientist, the man who basically invented most of Western thought before lunch. He set up a small school for Alexander and a few noble boys in a place called Mieza, surrounded by gardens, fountains, and endless scrolls. There, Alexander learned philosophy, mathematics, ethics, and, most importantly, how to believe that he was destined for greatness. Aristotle taught him about Homer's heroes, especially Achilles. Alexander adored Achilles. He kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated and probably slept better knowing that he was the modern version of a man who had once sulked for 3 chapters straight. But philosophy could only take him so far. Hecate was still the son of Philip, a man who valued sharp spears more than sharp minds. So, between lessons, Alexander learned to ride horses, throw spears, and lead men. And, in one famous story, he tamed a wild horse no one else could handle. A black stallion named Bucephalus. The court gasped, His father wept, and Alexander, barely a teenager, announced, "Father, look, there is nothing left for you to conquer. The world will be mine." Which is a bold thing to say when your allowance still comes from the person you're declaring obsolescence. Father and son, now, Philip and Alexander respected each other. In the same way, two lions might respect each other across a narrow valley. Philip was proud of his son's intelligence, but suspicious of his popularity. Alexander admired his father's brilliance, but resented being overshadowed. Things came to a head when Philip decided to remarry a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. At the wedding feast, a drunken relative toasted that Philip might now have a legitimate heir. Alexander, whose mother, Olympias, was not Macedonian, threw his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword, stumbled, being very drunk, and fell flat on his face. Alexander coolly remarked, "Here's a man who wants to cross from Europe into Asia, and he can't even cross the room." It was not the warmest father-son bonding moment. Alexander and Olympias fled Macedonia for a while, and though they reconciled eventually, the relationship never fully healed. Still, when Philip was assassinated, stabbed by his own bodyguard during a wedding procession, Alexander wasted no time. He took the throne at 20. Young king, old problems the moment Alexander became king. Everyone around him decided to rebel. Greek city-states rose up, northern tribes stirred, and the Macedonian nobles whispered that maybe he was too young for the job. So he did what any 20-year-old would do in that situation. He burned a city to the ground. The city was Thebes, one of Greece's proudest. They had rebelled, assuming the young king wouldn't dare retaliate. They were wrong. Alexander marched south, surrounded the city, and destroyed it. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, because even Alexander knew it was bad form to punish a poet. After that, the message was clear. Macedonia ruled Greece, and Alexander was not to be underestimated. The Greek cities fell into line. The army was loyal, and, as the dust settled, Alexander looked east, to Persia. The march to glory Persia was the superpower of the ancient world, vast, wealthy, and ruled by King Darius III. It had once invaded Greece. Now Alexander would return the favor. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men, kissed the shore of Asia, and declared himself the Avenger of Greece. It's hard not to admire his confidence. He was outnumbered, underfunded, and still in his 20s. But somehow, he made it look effortless. His first major victory came at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persians lined the opposite bank, waiting. Alexander, ignoring his general's advice, led the charge himself, because why let anyone else have the fun? He was nearly killed but survived, thanks to his men, and the victory opened the gates of Asia Minor. Town after town surrendered. Cities opened their gates. Alexander proclaimed himself liberator of the Greeks under Persian rule, which sounds generous until you notice that he immediately installed Macedonian governors in their place. A king on the move, Alexander's army marched ever eastward. They crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers, building bridges, founding cities, and occasionally naming them all after himself. There would eventually be more than 20 cities called Alexandria, which must have made ancient postal delivery a nightmare. He moved fast, rarely staying in one place. He was charming, ruthless, and endlessly restless. At night, he planned his next campaign. During the day, he led from the front, his white-plumed helmet gleaming in the sun. The Persians underestimated him again and again, and at the Battle of Issus, Alexander defeated Darius III personally. Darius fled the field, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated them kindly, which only made Darius's humiliation worse. He even told Darius's mother, "You shall be treated as a queen." It's a nice gesture, if you ignore that he caused her capture in the first place. Egypt and the god complex. By the time he reached Egypt, Alexander was a legend. The Persians were in retreat, and the Egyptians, long resentful of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. He founded yet another city, Alexandria, naturally, and visited the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis. There, the priests greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Alexander didn't argue. In fact, he started to like the idea. He began using divine titles, letting people kneel before him. He wasn't just king now. He was something more. The irony, of course, is that while he was claiming divinity, his men were starting to wonder if he'd lost touch with reality. Still, Egypt was just a pause. His eyes were fixed on Persia's heart. And in 331 BCE, at Gaugamela, he fought the battle that broke the empire. The fall of Persia at Gaugamela. Alexander faced Darius one last time. The Persian army was enormous, maybe 250,000 men. Alexander's, as usual, was smaller, but far more disciplined. The battle was chaos, chariots, horses, dust, and shouting. Alexander, at the head of his cavalry, saw a gap and charged straight for Darius. Once again, the Persian king fled. His army collapsed. Alexander entered Babylon, then Susa, then Persepolis, the Persian capitals. He took the treasures, the palaces, and, finally, the throne. But victory didn't bring peace. It brought questions. What next? He had conquered the mightiest empire in the world before turning 30. There was nowhere left to go, except farther east. The poisoned mirror. How dangerous was medieval makeup? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before dermatologists, before ingredient labels, and well before the phrase cruelty-free meant anything beyond your executioner was having a good day. We're going to talk about beauty, specifically the kind that could kill you. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a little. This won't be a dramatic tale of war or betrayal, just a quiet, steady stroll through the cosmetics cabinet of history, filled with lead, arsenic, vinegar, and a level of optimism that can only come from centuries without science. Because for much of medieval and Renaissance Europe, being beautiful meant being pale, deathly pale, in fact. A complexion that suggested you hadn't worked a day in your life, or seen sunlight since the Black Death. And the lengths people went to achieve that look were, frankly, astonishing. Her stepmothers came and went, mostly by decapitation. By adolescence, she'd learned the royal survival skills: speak softly, trust no one, and never be the prettiest woman in the room. Historians call her the Virgin Queen. Psychologists might call her the girl whose family ruined dating forever. Royal tutors, misery with manners. It's worth pausing to appreciate the unsung villains of royal childhoods. The tutors. These were usually underpaid intellectuals whose job was to make small children fluent in 5 languages and utterly terrified of mistakes. Let's start with the face, because that's where most of the chemical warfare happened. In the early Middle Ages, people already understood that pale skin meant privilege. The logic was simple. Tanned skin meant you worked outside, and working outside meant you were poor. So, naturally, everyone else began trying to look like a corpse, but a fashionable one. Women used a base called ceruse, a mix of vinegar and white lead. It gave a chalky, opaque finish that made you look delicate and ethereal, right up until it began corroding your skin. Lead. Being lead had a few side effects. It caused headaches, muscle weakness, and eventually neurological damage. It also blackened the skin over time, which meant the only way to keep your face looking white was to add more lead. A vicious cycle of toxic foundation layering. Imagine slowly poisoning yourself every morning in the name of radiance. It's like a skincare routine designed by a 14th century Bond villain. And this wasn't a peasant trend. It was royal. Queen Elizabeth II, in particular, was famously devoted to her. White lead foundation, the same Venetian ceruse used by aristocratic women across Europe. Elizabeth began using it heavily after a bout of smallpox left her with facial scars. She was already England's image of purity and perfection, the Virgin Queen, and naturally, a monarch who ruled through image needed that image to be flawless. So she painted it on daily, layer after layer. By her later years, her makeup had become almost a mask. Contemporaries described her skin as ghostly, her lips unnaturally red, thanks to cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment, and her hair. Well, her hair was a wig by then, probably several wigs. There's something quietly tragic about that. A powerful woman, commanding an empire, but slowly eroding her own face to maintain an impossible ideal. Her portraits, those perfect, doll-like images we still see in textbooks, were as much illusion as art. But Elizabeth didn't invent the poison vanity routine. She perfected it. Long before her, Venetian ladies in the 15th century had already made ceruse their signature. The recipe was lovingly prepared by steeping thin flakes of lead in vinegar until they dissolved into a paste. It smelled awful, stung the skin, and eventually caused the hair to fall out, which conveniently aligned with another beauty trend, high foreheads. In the 1400s, the ideal woman looked like she had a 5 head. or possibly a 7-head. A vast, smooth expanse of forehead was the mark of refinement. So, many noble women plucked their hairlines back several inches to achieve the look. Some even singed the roots with hot irons to make sure the hair didn't grow back too quickly. It's one of those little historical moments that make you pause and think, perhaps we shouldn't laugh at modern contouring tutorials. Let's drift across to France, where beauty routines tended to combine elegance with near-lethal creativity. In the court of Catherine de' Medici, perfumed powders and tinted balms became fashionable. Unfortunately, they were also laced with mercury and arsenic. Catherine herself was known to dabble in alchemy and perfumery, which in Renaissance France were practically the same thing. It wasn't uncommon for her ladies to dab a little arsenic dew on their faces to smooth the skin. It did smooth the skin by killing the outer layer of it. Nothing says refinement quite like a slow chemical burn. Later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, French courtiers went wild with rouge, heavy red blush applied in circular patches, sometimes so thick it could be scraped off. It was made from carmine, which came from crushed cochineal insects, or from mercury sulfide. The first option was unpleasant. The second was fatal. Men wore it too. Everyone at Versailles was painted, powdered, perfumed, and mildly poisoned. Of course, not everyone had access to Venetian ceruse or Parisian rouge, so the less fortunate improvised. In England, lower-ranking women used a mixture of chalk, egg whites, and flour as foundation. It didn't poison them as quickly, though it did have a tendency to crack off during conversation. Not ideal for flirting. Some people turned to herbs or milk washes, like rose water and honey, which were actually quite harmless. But naturally, no one famous used those, because in beauty, as in politics, if it didn't hurt, it wasn't worth it. Now, you might think men escaped all this. Not quite. During the late Renaissance and Baroque periods, noblemen also joined the Great Whitening Crusade. After all, what's the point of wearing silk stockings and lace collars if your skin doesn't match your shirt? Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, didn't personally use white lead, but many of his courtiers did. They powdered their faces, wore patches to cover pockmarks, and perfumed themselves heavily to disguise the smell of, well, 17th century hygiene, and yes, that includes the wigs. Those towering powdered wigs, they weren't just fashion statements, they were practical. After syphilis swept through Europe in the 1500s, many men lost their hair. Wigs became a stylish way to pretend they hadn't. They were dusted with starch or flour, sometimes scented with lavender or orange blossom, and, if you were unlucky, infested with lice. But, elegantly. Let's drift north to Tudor England again for a moment, because they truly excelled at bad skin care. Elizabeth's courtiers desperate to emulate her glow, which was, technically, corrosion, copied her cosmetic recipes. Men like Robert Dudley, her close companion, reportedly wore light powder to appear youthful at court. Some courtiers even painted on faint blue veins, with a brush to emphasize their delicate paleness, a look that suggested noble blood and very little circulation. Effect must have been haunting. A room full of nobles, faces powdered white, lips crimson, hairline receding on purpose, blue veins delicately painted along the temples, all by candlelight. An entire royal court slowly turning itself into porcelain dolls. It's almost peaceful in a macabre way. And yet, vanity was only half the reason for all this. Makeup was also armor. For women, especially queens and mistresses, appearance wasn't optional. It was political survival. A flawless face could mean favor, and favor meant safety. Losing your looks could mean exile, scandal, or worse. So, if your choice was between early wrinkles or early death, you went with the lead. That's why Elizabeth I never appeared in public without her full paint. Even when she was old and frail, her attendants reported spending hours applying her cosmetics. By then, the layers were so thick she looked, as one visitor described, like a statue of alabaster. A tragic image, but an effective one, because even as her body failed, her face remained the symbol of eternal majesty, and illusion was power. Of course, there were always reformers, doctors and moralists who tried to intervene. In the 1500s, medical texts warned that white lead consumes the flesh and enters into the bones, which was true, but fashion was stronger than reason. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that scientists began to make the connection between lead poisoning and the symptoms aristocrats had been quietly suffering for centuries: the tremors, the mood swings, the fainting spells, the mysterious deaths of otherwise healthy noble women in their 30s. In retrospect, European high society was basically a long-running public health crisis, but very well dressed. There's a certain irony in all of this. For centuries, people risked their lives to appear pure, untouched, and angelic. They died for the illusion of health, not realizing they were painting sickness directly onto their skin. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind these old beauty rituals. The strange, fragile human need to look invincible, even when we're literally falling apart. But don't worry, we're not finished yet. Let's drift over, in the next part, to the other side of Europe, to the courts of Italy, Austria, and Spain, where powdered faces met powdered wigs, and where the pursuit of beauty reached new, theatrical extremes. There we'll meet duchesses who bathed in vinegar, queens who painted their teeth, and one empress whose favorite beauty ingredient was, unfortunately, nightshade. So, stay comfortable. The Forgotten Orphans of Thrones tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter, darker corner of royal history. Somewhere between the glitter of the crown jewels and the sharp edge of the executioner's axe, there are children. The children of the condemned. They're the ones history tends to skip over. The quiet survivors of dynasties that fell apart in flames, or gossip, or debt, or just really bad politics. While their parents' names were carved into marble, their own stories dissolved into rumor, exile, and forgotten tombs. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Settle into your pillow, and let's drift back through a few centuries of royal disaster. We're not here for battles or treaties tonight. Just the small, sad aftermaths of big, loud downfalls. We'll start, naturally, with a family who did not do subtlety very well. The Tudors, the princes in the Tower, and the original Royal Vanishing Act, if you've ever heard the phrase, the princes in the Tower. You probably already know how this story ends. Or rather, how it doesn't, because no one ever actually found them. Back in 1483, England was in one of its periodic "we're not sure who the king is anymore" moods. The old king, Edward IV, had died, inconveniently leaving behind two young sons, Edward V, who was about 12, and his little brother Richard, Duke of York, who was 9. Both of them were technically heirs to the throne, which was, historically speaking, one of the worst things a child could be. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man who was roughly 50% ambition, 40% suspicion, and 10% physical deformity, depending on which source you ask, decided to protect them. Naturally, his idea of protection involved locking them inside the Tower of London for safekeeping. They were seen playing in the gardens a few times, and then not seen at all. No one knows exactly what happened, though everyone immediately suspected the uncle. And because history loves irony, he crowned himself Richard III shortly afterward. The official explanation was that the boys were illegitimate, and therefore not allowed to be kings. But that didn't stop people from whispering about murder, or from romanticizing it for the next 5 centuries. 2 skeletons were later found beneath a staircase in the tower. No, one can say for certain if they were the princes, but it didn't really matter. The image of 2 ghostly little boys, hidden under cold stone while their uncle took the throne, was enough to permanently ruin Richard's reputation, which, honestly, wasn't doing great anyway. And so our story begins with 2 royal children who vanished into the mist of medieval politics, symbols of innocence lost, or possibly just the world's earliest cold case. The spare who outlived everyone. Margaret Pole. If those 2 princes were history's lost children. Margaret Pole was one who lived far too long. She was born a Plantagenet, one of those family names that instantly put a target on your back in Tudor England. Her father, the Duke of Clarence, had been executed by his own brother, the king, for treason. The official story is that he was drowned in a butt of wine, which is exactly the sort of ridiculous, half-true rumor the Tudors thrived on. So Margaret grew up in a world where royal blood was both a blessing and a ticking time bomb. She married quietly, had children, and tried not to attract too much attention. Unfortunately, she failed, mostly by having sons who were too well born. When Henry VIII, yes, that Henry VIII, decided to create his own religious revolution for the sake of divorce and control, the Poles didn't cheer loudly enough. Margaret's son Reginald even fled to Rome and criticized Henry in print, which was not a survival tactic. In retaliation, Henry ordered the arrest of the entire family. Margaret, by then in her 60s, was imprisoned in the Tower for 2 years before being executed. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortably vivid. The executioner was inexperienced, and it reportedly took multiple blows to end her life. Her surviving children were scattered. One died in exile, another in poverty. The Tudor policy on children of traitors was simple. Don't let them become adults who might remember their claim. Marie Antoinette's daughter, the lonely survivor. Let's drift forward to a more powdered, candlelit age, the late 18th century, when wigs were high and heads were about to start rolling. Everyone knows what happened to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. The guillotine doesn't need much introduction, but very few remember their daughter, Marie-Thérèse, who lived long enough to become one of Europe's quietest ghosts. She was 14 when the revolution reached its bloody peak. Her father was executed first, then her mother, then her little brother, the so-called Louis XVI, who was kept in solitary confinement until he died, aged 10. That left her alone in the Temple prison for 3 years. 3 years of silence, isolation, and revolutionary guards mocking her from behind the walls. She didn't know when her family died, or even if she'd ever leave. When she was finally released in 1795, she stepped out into a Europe that had already replaced her parents with new regimes and new wars, and she never really recovered. She married her cousin, as one does, in that particular gene pool, and spent the rest of her life quietly shuffling between royal courts in exile. She never had children. She barely spoke of her past, but every so often people whispered about her. Some claimed she'd been swapped with another girl in prison, and that the real princess had died. Another legend born from royal paranoia. What's certain is that she spent the rest of her long, gray life haunted by the ghosts of Versailles, a walking reminder that revolutions may kill kings, but they leave survivors too broken to celebrate. Charles XXXIII Barton's children. The royal family that wouldn't stay. Dead, if we move back to England for a moment, we meet another set of unfortunate royal offspring. The children of Charles IV Charles, famously executed in 1649 after the English Civil War, left behind 9 children, and their fates were a kind of slow-motion tragedy that unfolded over decades. His eldest son became Charles II Aid. The Merry monarch, though merry, mostly meant womanizing his way through political chaos. His younger son, James, eventually became James II, who promptly lost the throne in the Glorious Revolution. But the younger children, that's where things get darker. 2 of his daughters died in captivity. One, Princess Elizabeth, died at age 15, imprisoned in the Isle of Wight. When her body was found, she had been holding a small Bible that her father had given her before his death. A tidy symbol, if an unbearably sad one. Another, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was taken prisoner at age 8 and spent his youth shuffled between captors. He survived the war only to die of smallpox soon after being reunited with his family. The surviving siblings spent years in exile, scattered across Europe, depending on the generosity of cousins and foreign monarchs who didn't particularly want them. The Restoration in 1660 brought some of them home, but the family was never whole again. Even when Charles II returned to the throne, it was under the heavy shadow of his father's execution, a sort of uneasy truce between monarchy and memory. For all the paintings of laughing courtiers and mistresses, there was always that ghost of a severed king behind them. And so the pattern repeats. The children of executed royals became either political hostages, tragic recluses, or forgotten footnotes. We like to imagine royal blood as protection, something that wraps you in luxury and power. But more often than not, it was the opposite. Royal birth made you too valuable to ignore, and too dangerous to let live. Let's drift to our next chapter. Quieter, colder, and far more continental, where imperial children carried their parents' downfall into exile. Rasputin convinced the Tsarina that prayer, not medicine, could heal the boy. Sometimes, when Alexei miraculously recovered from a bleeding episode, she believed it was divine intervention. It was more likely the temporary effects of rest and morphine. The Tsarevich grew up in near isolation, wrapped in secrecy and gauze, guarded by terrified parents who loved him to the point of smothering him. He never attended school, never had friends, and spent his short life as both a symbol and a patient. When the revolution came, he was executed with his family at age 13. He'd spent his entire life waiting to rule a world that no longer wanted kings. Henry VIII's tragic start, before he became that guy, before he was the bloated monarch with 6 unfortunate wives, Henry VIII was actually a bright, athletic, and rather charming child. The trouble began when his older brother, Arthur, the original heir, died young. Henry suddenly became the spare who wasn't supposed to matter. His father, Henry VII, wasn't known for warmth. He treated his remaining son like a state investment. Education replaced affection. Duty replaced freedom. When Henry VIII ascended the throne at 17, he was determined to have everything denied to him as a child. Affection, admiration, and constant attention. He got it all, and then demanded more. And when it faded, he cut off heads. A predictable outcome for a boy who learned that love must be earned, preferably by absolute obedience. The lonely little queen, Elizabeth Thrice, his daughter, Elizabeth Thorncease, had a childhood so melodramatic it could have been scripted by Shakespeare, which, conveniently, it sort of was. Her father alternated between pretending she didn't exist and occasionally deciding she might. I hope you will now sleep and enjoy our story. And please like and subscribe my channel, The Ones Who Slipped Out Quietly. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, to a quieter world where bells marked the hours, candles marked the seasons, and obedience was supposed to last forever. But, of course, it didn't always, because not every medieval nun was there by divine calling. Some were there by accident, some by parental strategy, and a few by sheer bad luck. And occasionally, one of them decided she'd had enough and ran away. So tonight, we're exploring a question that's both oddly comforting and faintly tragic. Why did so many medieval nuns run away from convents? Let's start with a scene. It's late at night, sometime in the 14th century. A convent stands at the edge of a sleepy European town. Stone walls, candlelight in narrow windows, and silence thick enough to make even God clear his throat. Inside, the sisters are supposed to be asleep, but one isn't. She's quietly gathering her things. Not much. Maybe a small purse, a keepsake, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She pauses at the door, listening for the sound of the night watch. Then she slips into the dark. No torches, no horses. Just one woman walking briskly into the unknown, praying no one notices until morning. For centuries, this kind of quiet escape happened more often than you'd think. And the reasons behind it tell us a lot about how the medieval world treated women, especially women who weren't given a choice. Now, the idea of being a nun sounds peaceful. vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. A life of prayer, study, and gardening in silence. But for many, it wasn't so much a calling as a convenient solution to someone else's problem. If you were a noble family with too many daughters, you couldn't marry them all off. Dowries were expensive, so one or two might be sent to a convent instead. It was cheaper and still respectable. The family could proudly say their daughter was a bride of Christ, which sounded noble and conveniently reduced the inheritance bills. Unfortunately, not everyone asked the bride for her opinion. Many of these girls were placed in convents as children, as young as 7 or 8, long before they understood what vows actually meant. They were raised by nuns, taught to read Latin prayers, embroider, and obey. And when they came of age, they were told, sometimes quite suddenly, that their calling had been decided for them. Some accepted it, some even thrived, finding education, purpose, and friendship within the walls. But others looked around and realized they weren't in a holy sanctuary. They were in a lifetime prison with better singing. Now, medieval law wasn't exactly designed for freedom of choice. Once you'd taken your vows, even under pressure, leaving the convent was considered apostasy, a serious sin. A runaway nun wasn't just disobedient. She was a criminal. Canon law required her to be hunted down, returned, and sometimes publicly punished, usually not violently, but through confinement or penance. The church treated disobedient nuns a bit like escaped property, someone's spiritual investment gone rogue. But that didn't stop them from trying. The church archives, which are, by the way, full of deeply unamused paperwork, contain hundreds of petitions from the 12th to the 15th centuries describing missing nuns. One report might begin, "Sister Agnes departed her house without permission." Another notes that the nun Johanna absconded in the night, taking with her certain items unbecoming her station. Those items unbecoming her station were often shoes, because, of course, nuns weren't supposed to own much. But you can't exactly walk barefoot out of a convent. And where did they go? That depended on who they were running from, and who they were running to. Some fled to nearby relatives, hoping for shelter and maybe a legal advocate who could negotiate their release. Others disguised themselves as laywomen and vanished into the wider world, living as servants, merchants, or even teachers, pretending they'd never seen a rosary in their life. There are records of some who fled straight into marriage, not just romance, full elopement, which naturally caused chaos for everyone involved. Because in the eyes of the church, a runaway nun couldn't marry. Her vows were indissoluble, even if she'd been forced into them. So, any marriage she entered was invalid, and both she and her new husband could be excommunicated. Not that this stopped people. Love, or at least defiance, is stubborn that way. One of the most famous runaway nuns in history was Joan of Leeds, a 14th-century Benedictine from northern England. According to church records, which, again, are written in the disapproving tone of a disappointed parent, Joan faked her own death to escape her convent. The Archbishop of York noted that Joan had impudently cast aside the propriety of religion and the modesty of her sex, which is medieval clerical language for she pulled off quite the stunt. Joan apparently crafted a fake body, perhaps using a dummy or a corpse, and staged her own burial. Then she slipped away, alive and well, and took up a carnal life somewhere in town. We don't know what happened next, but we can assume the church wasn't sending her Christmas cards. Joan wasn't alone. Across Europe, there were countless lesser-known Joans. Women who quietly decided that divine calling wasn't quite as divine as it sounded. In 15th-century France, Sister Marguerite fled her convent 3 times, each time brought back by local officials who probably started charging mileage. Another, Sister Clara of Milan, left to become a midwife. And one German nun was discovered, living openly as a brewer's wife, which, honestly, might be the most medieval career pivot imaginable. Now, to be fair, not every runaway was rebelling against the system. Some fled because of genuine hardship, mistreatment, hunger, or illness. Convents weren't always the serene gardens of devotion they appeared in paintings. Many were underfunded, overcrowded, or badly managed. Some abbesses ruled with iron discipline. Others couldn't feed their sisters properly, leading to sickness and despair. And some convents simply collapsed into dysfunction. Nuns fighting, stealing, and occasionally sneaking out to local taverns. There are records of convents where the bishop had to step in because the sisters were behaving in a manner more fitting to worldly women, which is polite medieval language for there was probably alcohol involved. But the deeper reason, the one that lingers quietly beneath all of this, was agency. For many women, the convent was the only place they could be educated, respected, or even heard. And yet, the price of that safety was lifelong obedience. When you consider that, running away wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation, a quiet declaration that they wanted to live their own lives, even if that meant risking everything. Of course, the church had to respond. If too many nuns started disappearing, the whole system would look shaky. So, over time, convents became more enclosed, literally walled in. By the late Middle Ages, nuns were expected to live under strict enclosure, meaning they could not leave the convent without permission, and outsiders could not enter freely. The idea was to protect chastity and focus on prayer. But it also turned many convents into what were, in effect, spiritual prisons. Some abbesses even locked the gates and kept the keys themselves. If a nun still managed to escape, she could be excommunicated, and anyone helping her could face the same punishment, which sounds severe, because it was, but that didn't entirely stop them. Some escapes were almost comically elaborate. In 13th century Saxony, a group of nuns reportedly bribed a guard with wine, then climbed out through the kitchen window. In another case, 2 sisters hid in barrels of laundry being sent out of the convent for washing, and occasionally the convent's own staff turned a blind eye, either out of sympathy or exhaustion. Imagine being the gatekeeper who decides that if Sister Agnes wants to go pray in the orchard for 3 hours, that's between her and God. What's striking is that the Church often handled these cases quietly. Public scandal wasn't good for anyone, so if the runaway nun could be persuaded or pressured to return, things were usually smoothed over with a bit of repentance and a stern lecture. If she refused, her family might be forced to intervene, and if she disappeared completely, the paperwork would simply note that she had fallen away. It's an oddly gentle phrase for someone who defied the entire medieval religious hierarchy. Still, despite all the risks, convents continued to lose nuns. And behind every case file, there's a story we'll never fully know. A girl who dreamed of life beyond the walls, who wanted to see a city, fall in love, or simply breathe air that wasn't approved by an abbess. We remember queens and saints because their lives were written down. But the runaway nuns, they left no hymns, no chronicles, no portraits. Just the faint echo of footsteps in a cloister corridor, and the knowledge that somewhere, someone decided not to obey. Let's drift, then, to what happened after. Because some of those runaways were caught, some disappeared forever, and a few, surprisingly, found a way to make peace with the Church. In Part 2, we'll wander through the strange afterlives of these women, the ones who came back, the ones who negotiated their freedom, and the rare few who managed to build entirely new identities. But for now, imagine that quiet convent again. The candlelight flickering against cold stone walls. The scent of beeswax and incense. And somewhere beyond the gate, a figure walking down the road. Alone, but finally free. The quiet life of the executioner. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when justice came with an audience, the smell of iron, and, quite often, a poorly sharpened axe. So, go ahead, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe pour something warm. Because we're about to spend some time with a few people who never quite fit anywhere, and yet were always standing at the center of history. Tonight's story is called "What Did Medieval Executioners Do When They Weren't Killing People?" Because, believe it or not, they did quite a lot, and most of it was surprisingly domestic. Let's start with an image. A gray morning in 15th century Europe. A small crowd is gathering in the town square, as people tend to do when someone's about to be shortened by a head. The executioner stands quietly nearby, hood or no hood, depending on the country, holding an axe that's been used more times than anyone likes to admit. His job is, in theory, simple: deliver justice in one clean stroke. But the truth? Most executioners were not the grim professional you imagine. They were complicated, often underpaid, frequently drunk, and almost always deeply unpopular. Because, while everyone wanted justice done, no one really wanted to know the man who did it. So what did these men, and occasionally women, do with the rest of their time? Let's drift first to Germany, where the executioner's role was something between public official, town cleaner, and local pariah. You see, if you were the Scharfrichter, literally the sharp judge, you weren't just swinging blades. You were also responsible for all the dirty jobs no one else wanted. Disposing of carcasses, cleaning the sewers, burning diseased clothing. If it smelled terrible or carried the plague, it was probably yours to handle. Executioners were also expected to deal with prostitutes, gamblers, and the occasional wandering lunatic. Essentially, if society didn't like you, or didn't know what to do with you, you were probably going to meet the executioner at some point, either professionally or socially. The strange thing is that despite this grim resume, executioners often came from long family lines. The job was hereditary, passed from father to son, so if you were born into it, congratulations. You'd never have to apply for work, but also, you'd never be welcome anywhere else. They lived on the edge of town, both literally and socially. Their homes were usually near the gallows, or the execution field, so that they didn't contaminate the good citizens by existing too close. But, and here's the odd twist, because executioners dealt with blood, wounds, and anatomy, they became rather good at medicine. That's right. When they weren't chopping off heads, many executioners acted as unofficial surgeons. After all, they were familiar with the human body. Perhaps too familiar. They learned how to stop bleeding, set bones, and treat infections. And because they handled criminals, corpses, and the diseased, they often kept detailed notes, part anatomical study, part morbid curiosity. Some even developed a reputation for miraculous cures. The same man who executed your cousin for theft might later heal your broken leg. For a price, Of course, there's something almost poetic about that. They both caused and cured pain, depending on the day. One of the most famous examples comes from the 17th century executioner Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg. Schmidt is something of a legend, not for how many people he killed, but for how meticulously he recorded it. He kept a diary for decades. Every hanging, every beheading, every branding, every flogging, all written down in careful, almost gentle handwriting. By the time he retired, he'd executed 394 people and flogged or mutilated hundreds more. And yet, his diary reads less like a sadistic brag sheet and more like a man quietly doing his job and hoping it all meant something. When he wasn't killing, he worked as a healer. People came to his door for treatments, herbal remedies, wound care, even minor surgeries. In fact, when he finally retired, the city of Nuremberg granted him the title of Master Surgeon. Imagine that. A man who had spent his life ending lives was officially recognized as someone who saved them. But not all executioners were treated so kindly. In France, for example, the role was even more stigmatized. Executioners were considered tainted by death. They couldn't live among regular townsfolk. They couldn't marry outside their own profession, unless someone was very desperate. And if they entered a church, people might physically move away from them. Some towns required executioners to wear special clothing in public, so that everyone knew what they were. It was a scarlet letter made of leather and bloodstains. And yet, despite being ostracized, they were vital. No justice system could run without them. So while priests saved souls and knights defended honor, the executioner quietly kept the system from collapsing by making sure everyone remembered what happened when you didn't follow the rules. Let's drift for a moment to a smaller, stranger corner of Europe, Switzerland. In the 1500s, Swiss executioners often doubled as animal control officers. They collected stray dogs, put down rabid ones, and disposed of animal carcasses. A Swiss chronicle from the time mentions an executioner who also served as the town's rat-catcher general. It's an oddly fitting combination. After all, if you're already accustomed to killing people for a living, rats are hardly a moral challenge, and the same tools often applied: knives, traps, and occasionally a bucket of something unpleasant. So, while the city slept, the executioner was out in the streets, torch in hand, driving rats from cellars and sewers. It's not glamorous, but it was steady work. Because executions were not daily events. Contrary to what we might imagine, the average medieval executioner might perform only a few executions each year, sometimes none at all. That left a lot of time to fill. So, To make ends meet, they developed side businesses. They sold herbs. They ran taverns. They sold animal hides, or the remnants of their professional work. Yes, that means they occasionally sold bits of executed criminals as magical charms. Disgusting. Yes, but very profitable. You see, the medieval world was deeply superstitious, and the parts of executed criminals were thought to have power. The fat of a hanged man could supposedly cure gout. The rope used in the hanging was said to bring good luck or protection. Even the skulls of executed men were used to brew medicinal potions. Executioners were the only ones who had legal access to these ingredients. So they became reluctant pharmacists of the macabre. Imagine visiting your local healer for a sore throat, and he quietly asks if you'd prefer something from a freshly deceased thief. Yes, that happened. Their children, meanwhile, faced a strange fate. Most couldn't find respectable marriages, so they often married within the executioner families, forming tight, isolated clans that lasted for generations. There are records of certain dynasties of executioners in Germany and France who kept the role for over 200 years. The surname Sanson, for example, became famous in France. 6 generations of executioners, all serving the French crown, right up to the guillotine. The most famous, Charles-Henri Sanson, executed over 3,000 people during the French Revolution, including King Louis XVI himself. He reportedly found the entire affair emotionally exhausting, which, to be fair, seems reasonable. But even he, like so many others, found himself torn between duty and disgust, because executioners lived in constant contradiction, both agents of justice and victims of their own profession. And yet, they weren't monsters, at least not most of them. They were men born into a role the world despised, trying to survive in a system that used them but never accepted them. Many of them were surprisingly gentle at home, raising families, tending gardens, and caring for their animals. Their homes, though on the edge of town, were often described as tidy and modest, with small vegetable plots and herb gardens. They tended their gardens with the same precision they brought to their official work, though one imagines the vegetables were much more cooperative. There are records of executioners keeping pets, cats, dogs, even birds, though townspeople sometimes refused to touch them. Superstition held that a dog owned by an executioner might carry bad luck, as though misfortune were contagious by leash, but the executioners themselves seemed largely indifferent to this fear. They'd long ago stopped expecting kindness from the world. What mattered more was professional pride. A clean execution meant respect, or at least fewer complaints. A botched one meant humiliation. sometimes violence from the crowd, and, in rare cases, execution themselves, because nothing says high-pressure job. Quite like being punished for not killing someone properly. Let's pause here and breathe for a moment. Picture the executioner's cottage on a quiet evening. No crowds, no shouting, no gallows, just a man sitting by the fire, perhaps sharpening his tools or mending a pair of gloves. Maybe his children are asleep, unaware that their father's workday involves ending lives. Next, we'll drift a little deeper into the world of these unlikely professionals. How they trained their apprentices, the strange privileges they held, and the darkly comical ways towns tried to pretend they didn't exist. So, for now, let's rest here, in that quiet cottage by the gallows. The fire crackles softly. The tools gleam faintly in the light. And outside, the town sleeps, unaware that their safety depends on the man everyone refuses to speak to, born under the wrong moon. Tonight, we're drifting back to the age of witches. Not the Halloween kind with broomsticks and pointy hats. The real, quietly terrifying kind, whose trials turned entire villages against their own neighbors. The kind that made people whisper after sunset and stare a little too long at the woman next door. But this isn't a story about witches. It's about the children they left behind. Because when the hysteria faded and the ashes cooled, someone was always left standing there, confused, shunned, and small. So, let's dim the lights, settle in, and drift back to a world where superstition ruled everything, and where being born to the wrong mother could ruin your life before it even began. We like to imagine that the witch trials were about adult fears, about strange herbs, strange weather, or strange women who dared to live alone. And yes, those things mattered. But woven through those stories is a quieter thread. The children, the ones who saw their mothers accused, the ones who testified, often without understanding, and the ones who grew up with a name no one wanted to say out loud. Let's start, gently, in 16th century Europe, Tadritidal Kansenantirur, where the witch hunts were just beginning to catch fire. To be clear, children weren't rare in these cases. Sometimes they were witnesses, sometimes victims, and sometimes, horrifyingly, accused themselves because superstition doesn't stop at reason. It doesn't even slow down for childhood. Imagine a small village in southern Germany, half-timbered houses, smoky hearths, and gossip traveling faster than the wind. Now imagine you're 8 years old. Your mother's been taken to the magistrate's hall. You've seen her dragged through the street, and you've heard the neighbors whisper, "Witch! You don't really understand what that means, but you know it's bad. And when the priest comes to ask you questions, you answer what you think he wants to hear. Did your mother talk to animals? You hesitate. Sometimes? Did she ever give you strange food? Well, she makes stew. Did she ever make you say words you didn't know? You nod, because once she made you learn a prayer in Latin. And just like that, your words become evidence. This isn't just imagination. It's taken directly from trial records. In Würzburg, Bamberg, and Trier, some of the deadliest centers of witch trials in Europe, children were not only witnesses, but full participants. Sometimes they even became prosecutors without realizing it. In Würzburg alone, over 600 people were executed between 1626 and 1631. Among them were dozens of children, some as young as 9. A letter from 1629 describes one boy, barely 10 years old, confessing that he had attended the devil's Sabbath. Under torture, he named his own mother. Both were executed. It's easy to call that cruelty, but it's more accurate to call it panic, weaponized and sanctified. And the aftermath? That's where things get very quiet, because once the mother was gone, burned, hanged, or banished, the community rarely knew what to do with the children. Some were taken in by distant relatives. Others were sent to church orphanages, which were less about compassion and more about discipline. And many simply disappeared from the records. There are entire pages of parish books where a family name stops, abruptly, after a trial. No births, no marriages, just silence. We can see glimpses, though in a few scattered documents, in Scotland. For instance, after the North Berwick witch trials of the 1590s, the children of accused women were often branded as tainted. Even if no one officially punished them, they were socially exiled. No one would marry them, and few would hire them. Imagine growing up in a small fishing town where everyone knows your surname, and no one will meet your eyes. One young boy from those records, Thomas Fian's son, was said to have wandered from place to place, surviving on odd labor and charity. His mother's supposed witchcraft followed him for the rest of his life, like an invisible mark. In England, things were quieter, but no kinder. When the Pendle witch trials took place in 1612, several of the accused were entire families. 8-year-old Janet Device was called as a witness against her own mother, Elizabeth. During the trial, she was placed on a table in the courtroom so everyone could hear her clearly. She spoke of seeing her mother talking to the devil, and of secret meetings in the woods. The crowd believed her. The jury believed her. Her mother was hanged. Janet herself lived, but later, years later, she too would be accused. By then, the cycle had come full circle. It's tempting to think of the witch trials as medieval or primitive, but they weren't confined to distant centuries. They lasted deep into the 18th century, and their logic wasn't all that far from our own. The fear of contamination, of bad blood, of guilt by association. Those are all very human reflexes. We just happen to wrap them, for a while, in theology and fire. One of the saddest examples comes from Salem, in the American colonies, in 1692. We know the broad strokes, the hysteria, the accusations, the hangings, but the children of the accused, they lived through something harder to dramatize. When the trials ended, their mothers' names were written into the history books, but their own were quietly erased. Many of them were left without property, without protection, and without a way to clear their names. Colonial law didn't exactly have a "sorry, we executed your mom" clause, so a few of them wrote petitions, fragile little documents trying to repair their lives. One of the most touching is from Sarah Good's daughter, Dorcas, who was only 4 when she was imprisoned alongside her mother. The jailers noted she cried much and was greatly terrified. Sarah Good was hanged. Dorcas survived, but never fully recovered. Later records describe her as broken in mind. We'd call it trauma now. Back then, it was simply God's mysterious will. And yet, even in that darkness, there were flickers of resilience. In Germany, a few orphaned children were quietly adopted by sympathetic clergy. In Denmark, after King Christian IV banned torture in witch trials, some of the accused women's children were granted small stipends. A royal attempt at mercy that came about a century too late for most. And in Salem, decades after the trials, the descendants of those executed began to receive symbolic compensation. Small payments, public apologies, and occasionally exonerations. By then, of course, the children were long gone. What's striking, looking through all this, is how these children were both invisible and essential. Invisible in life, but essential in creating. The myth of the witch, because the image of a witch wasn't just an old woman with herbs. It was a mother, and the easiest way to prove she was unnatural was to show that even her children turned against her. So those frightened testimonies, the ones given through tears or under pressure, became the perfect evidence. The E.T. witch wasn't just a heretic. She was a failed parent. That's what made her terrifying. You can almost hear it in the language of the trials. She bewitched her own child. She nursed a familiar spirit from her breast. She dedicated her infant to the devil. Each of these was a way of saying she inverted nature itself, and the child, that living proof of her failure, became both victim and witness. It's no wonder so many of them grew up haunted. In a few rare cases, we can trace what happened when those children reached adulthood. In Norway, there's the story of Karen Thorsdatter, whose mother was burned for witchcraft in 1622. Karen survived, but later records show she moved far inland, changed her name, and lived quietly as a weaver. She married, had children, and, unusually, managed to keep her secret. But when she died, her descendants avoided mentioning her mother in family histories. Even 2 centuries later, the shame still lingered. These stories feel distant, medieval, foreign, tragic, but they whisper something familiar. Every era has its scapegoats, and every time a community decides to destroy someone for its own peace of mind, it leaves orphans behind. The witch trials may be over, but the pattern, blame, punishment, forgetting, still repeats in quieter ways. That's part of why these stories matter. They remind us that superstition isn't always about magic. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a very old costume, and tomorrow, of course, there might be work. Someone might be scheduled for hanging, or the local council might request a branding or a flogging, or perhaps no one at all, in which case the executioner will go about cleaning tools, treating wounds, or collecting his small municipal salary. The job, in its way, was routine, predictable, almost boring, if you could ignore the blood. It's an odd mix of peace and horror, the kind that defines so much of medieval life. Because under all the superstition and ceremony, people were still just people, trying to make sense of their roles, however strange or grim they might be. By adulthood, she was brilliant, poised, and deeply suspicious of intimacy. She never married, but it's that mixture, the banal and the brutal, that makes the medieval executioner so fascinating. Wasn't a villain, he wasn't a hero. He was just the man the system needed when things went wrong. As the candles burn lower, let's drift forward to what became of the so-called witch children when the flames went out and Europe moved on. How did they rebuild lives that had been erased? Who helped them? And did any of them ever find peace or forgiveness? That's where we'll wander next. The fragrance of history. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where perfume was made from boiled flowers. Sewage ran down the street, and the average person considered bathing something you did if you were dying, or possibly French. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, and try not to imagine the smell, because tonight we're talking about something historians rarely mention out loud. How people in the Middle Ages actually smelled. And, yes, it was complicated. Let's start by setting the scene. Picture a narrow, cobbled street somewhere in 14th century Paris or London. There's a butcher's shop on one side, an open sewer on the other, and a cheerful little pile of horse dung right in the middle. just to keep things festive. Now, the air isn't entirely awful. There's wood smoke from the hearths, the faint sweetness of bread baking, and the herbal scent of ale from a nearby tavern. But then there's also the other stuff. The tanners boiling hides, the chamber pots emptied out of upstairs windows, the dead animals waiting for someone to notice them. So, it wasn't great. But here's the funny thing. For medieval people, this was normal. This was what home smelled like. Now, the popular myth is that medieval people never bathed, that they walked around in a fog of filth and sweat, occasionally masked with rose water or incense if they were fancy. But the truth is, a little gentler. They didn't bathe as often as we do, of course, but they did care about cleanliness, just not in the modern shampoo commercial way. For one thing, they didn't have the same idea of body odor we do. The modern obsession with deodorant, mouthwash, and antibacterial everything? That's a product of industrialization and advertising. In the Middle Ages, smell wasn't something you eliminated. It was something you managed. If you smelled of lavender or rosemary, people thought you were healthy. If you smelled faintly of garlic, onions, or tallow, well, that just meant you'd eaten recently, which was enviable. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. Medieval Europe actually had public bathhouses. Lots of them. Even small towns might have a couple. Cheerful, steamy places where men and women bathed together, drank wine, and sometimes did things that were not entirely sanitary, morally or otherwise. Bathhouses were social spaces, half spa, half tavern, occasionally half brothel, depending on the establishment. People would soak in warm, perfumed water, chat with neighbors, have a meal, maybe get a massage with scented oils. So, yes, medieval people did bathe. Quite a lot, in fact, especially before the 15th century. The problem was, hygiene had a PR crisis. When the Black Death struck in the 1300s, people started to believe that water opened the pores and made disease more likely to enter the body. And so, public bathing became suspect. It's hard to relax in a steamy tub when half the population thinks you're soaking up plague. So, the bathhouses slowly closed, and dry washing became the thing. This involved rubbing the body with linen cloths, herbs, or even fine sand to remove dirt and sweat. A sort of medieval exfoliation routine. Less bubble bath, more gentle sandpaper. Wealthier people sometimes sprinkled themselves with powdered orris root, rose petals, or ambergris, which sounds romantic until you remember ambergris comes from whale intestines. But again, context. Everything smelled terrible. If something didn't, you counted it as divine intervention. Now, not everyone could afford perfumed powders. Ordinary folks, peasants, artisans, small merchants, had to make do with simpler methods. they might rinse their hands and faces daily, especially before meals. Feet, maybe once a week. A full-body wash, perhaps a few times a year, or for special occasions like weddings, holidays, or if you'd somehow fallen into a swamp. They weren't filthy by their own standards, just efficient. Soap was expensive, hot water was hard work, and honestly, most of them were too busy trying to stay alive to worry about smelling fresh for strangers. Now, medieval soap itself was not ideal. It was made from animal fat and lye, which gave it the delicate fragrance of wet sheep and ashtray. A few regions made gentler versions using olive oil, Castile soap, for instance, but that was imported and pricey. So unless you were wealthy, washing could feel more like a punishment than refreshment. The upper classes sometimes used vinegar rinses instead, believed to both clean and protect against disease. If you were rich enough, you might have a servant rub you down with linen soaked in rose water, which sounds pleasant until you remember that rose water in medieval times sometimes included crushed beetles for color. Hygiene, like most things in the Middle Ages, was a creative compromise. Now, let's talk about clothing. Because while people didn't wash their bodies constantly, they did wash their clothes. Sort of linen undergarments, the famous medieval chemise or shirt, acted as a barrier between the body and the outer clothes. Linen is absorbent and easier to wash than wool or silk, so people changed those layers fairly often. A noblewoman might have a clean shift every day. A peasant, maybe once a week, but the principle was the same. Rather than wash your whole body, you changed the layer that touched it. In effect, medieval people outsourced cleanliness to fabric. And surprisingly, it worked. Up to a point. Linen does a decent job of absorbing sweat and oils, and when laundered with hot water, ashes, and sunlight, it smells relatively fine. It's no lavender detergent, but it kept people from becoming walking compost heaps. What smelled worse were the outer clothes. Heavy wool gowns, leather boots, padded doublets, which could go months without washing. Some garments were never washed at all, just brushed and aired out. You can imagine how that went during summer festivals. Now, we should probably address the elephant, or perhaps the dung cart, in the room. Toilets. Medieval sanitation systems ranged from surprisingly advanced to please never speak of this again. Castles often had small stone alcoves called garderobes, essentially seats built into the wall, where waste dropped down a chute into a moat or pit. If you were lucky, the pit drained into a river. If not, well, you had a very fragrant courtyard. Towns had public latrines, usually over running water, but chamber pots were far more common. And yes, people did occasionally empty them out the window with a polite warning cry of, Gardes l'eau, mind the water. Which sounds charming until you remember it wasn't water. So, yes, the streets could smell, but so did the animals, the tanneries, the bakeries, and the people themselves. Everyone shared the same air, and no one was innocent. Still, medieval folks weren't oblivious to smell. In fact, they believed odors carried meaning, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic. A pleasant scent was considered a sign of moral purity or health. Saints were said to emit a sweet odor, even in death, the odor of sanctity. Meanwhile, a bad smell could be evidence of sin, sickness, or spiritual corruption. So when someone reeked, it wasn't just unpleasant. It was suspicious. This belief led to some creative solutions. People carried pomanders, small metal spheres filled with herbs or perfumed wax, and held them to their noses in crowded streets. Doctors used long, beaked masks stuffed with lavender and cloves to ward off miasma or bad air. Basically, everyone was trying to survive a world that smelled like a compost bin on a hot day. Now, let's drift into the royal courts, where the rich did what the rich always do, made everything more complicated. At the French court of the 14th century, perfume was everywhere. Not subtle perfume either. Heavy, oily, musky scents made from ambergris, civet, or musk. All animal-based and all vaguely horrifying in their origins. Rooms were fumigated with burning herbs. Gloves were perfumed. Even letters were scented. Because why just annoy someone with politics when you can also give them a headache? Queen Isabella of Bavaria reportedly kept a personal perfumer who followed her everywhere, like a medieval air freshener. And yet, despite the luxury, the royal palaces themselves often stank. Chamber pots overflowed. Food waste piled up in courtyards. Servants dumped refuse out back doors. Terrible. Contrast was almost poetic. Clouds of jasmine, and civet drifting over a moat that smelled like yesterday's dinner and last week's sins. But some nobles were genuinely clean, even by modern standards. King Henry III of France bathed daily and wore freshly laundered shirts multiple times a day. Unfortunately, his hygiene was considered eccentric, even effeminate, because in many medieval minds, water was for fish, not for kings. So, how bad did they really smell? The honest answer is, not as bad as we imagine, but certainly not good. The poor smelled of work, the rich smelled of perfume, and the world smelled of everything trying to coexist without plumbing. But under all of that, there was a kind of human resilience, a shared endurance of the senses, a quiet acceptance that life was messy and smelly, and beautiful in its own strange way. Let's drift now to the next part of our story. Deeper into the perfumed halls and filthy streets, where smell was power, status, and superstition all at once. We'll meet queens who drowned themselves in musk, monks who refused to bathe for holiness, and the people who tried very hard to invent deodorant 5 centuries too early. But for now, let's rest in that quiet, smoky room. The fire crackling, the linen drying by the hearth, and the faint scent of herbs in the air. Not perfect, not sterile, just medieval. The forgotten orphans of thrones. Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, darker corner of royal history, somewhere between the glitter of the crown jewels and the sharp edge of the executioner's axe. There are children, the children of the condemned. They're the ones history tends to skip over, the quiet survivors of dynasties that fell apart in flames, or gossip, or debt, or just really bad politics. While their parents' names were carved into marble, their own stories dissolved into rumor, exile, and forgotten tombs. So, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, settle into your pillow, and let's drift back through a few centuries of royal disaster. We're not here for battles or treaties tonight, just the small, sad aftermaths of big, loud downfalls. We'll start, naturally, with a family who did not do subtlety very well, the Tudors. Still, royal inventories from the late Middle Ages list rosewater basins, silver soap boxes, and bathing tubs, suggesting that hygiene, while rare, was not entirely forgotten. The wealthy just preferred to let servants do most of the washing. In some courts, bathing became a ritual act. Perfumed water, music, poetry, and wine, all for a brief soak that was as much theater as cleanliness. Meanwhile, back in the villages, people made do. They burned juniper or rosemary to freshen the air. They wore sprigs of herbs pinned to their clothes to ward off bad smells and, hopefully, bad luck. A house that smelled too clean might actually be suspicious. It suggested illness, or that someone was trying to hide something. And perhaps the most striking thing is that people adapted. They didn't notice the smells that would make us faint today, because it was simply the scent of life, of hearth smoke, animals, sweat, and bread. To them, that was normal. To us, it's medieval. The princes in the tower, and the original Royal Vanishing Act. If you've ever heard the phrase, "the princes in the tower," you probably already know how this story ends. Or rather, how it doesn't, because no one ever actually found them. Back in 1483, England was in one of its periodic "we're not sure who the king is anymore" moods. The old king, Edward IV, had died, inconveniently leaving behind 2 young sons. Edward V, who was about 12, and his little brother Richard, Duke of York, who was 9. Both of them were technically heirs to the throne, which was, historically speaking, one of the worst things a child could be. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man who was roughly 50% ambition, 40% suspicion, and 10% physical deformity, depending on which source you ask, decided to protect them. Naturally, his idea of protection involved locking them inside the Tower of London for safekeeping. They were seen playing in the gardens a few times, and then not seen at all. No one knows exactly what happened, though everyone immediately suspected the uncle. And because history loves irony, he crowned himself Richard III shortly afterward. The official explanation was that the boys were illegitimate, and therefore not allowed to be kings. But that didn't stop people from whispering about murder, or from romanticizing it for the next 5 centuries. 2 skeletons were later found beneath a staircase in the tower. No one can say for certain if they were the princes, but it didn't really matter. The image of 2 ghostly little boys, hidden under cold stone while their uncle took the throne, was enough to permanently ruin Richard's reputation, which, honestly, wasn't doing great anyway. And so our story begins with 2 royal children who vanished into the mist of medieval politics, symbols of innocence lost, or possibly just the world's earliest cold case. The Spare Who Outlived Everyone. Margaret Pole. If those 2 princes were history's lost children, Margaret Pole was one who lived far too long. She was born a Plantagenet, one of those family names that instantly put a target on your back in Tudor England. Her father, the Duke of Clarence, had been executed by his own brother, the king, for treason. The official story is that he was drowned in a butt of wine, which is exactly the sort of ridiculous, half-true rumor the Tudors thrived on. So Margaret grew up in a world where royal blood was both a blessing and a ticking time bomb. She married quietly, had children, and tried not to attract too much attention. Unfortunately, she failed. Mostly by having sons who were too well born. When Henry VIII, Henry VIII decided to create his own religious revolution for the sake of divorce and control, the Poles didn't cheer loudly enough. Margaret's son Reginald even fled to Rome and criticized Henry in print, which was not a survival tactic. In retaliation, Henry ordered the arrest of the entire family. Margaret, by then in her 60s, was imprisoned in the Tower for 2 years before being executed. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortably vivid. The executioner was inexperienced, and it reportedly took multiple blows to end her life. Her surviving children were scattered. One died in exile, another in poverty. The Tudor policy on children of traitors was simple. Don't let them become adults who might remember their claim. Marie Antoinette's daughter, the lonely survivor. let's drift forward to a more powdered, candlelit age, the late 18th century, when wigs were high and heads were about to start rolling. Everyone knows what happened to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. The guillotine doesn't need much introduction. But very few remember their daughter, Marie-Thérèse, who lived long enough to become one of Europe's quietest ghosts. She was 14 when the revolution reached its bloody peak. Her father was executed first, then her mother, then her little brother, the so-called Louis XVII, who was kept in solitary confinement until he died, aged 10. That left her alone in the Temple prison for 3 years. 3 years of silence, isolation, and revolutionary guards mocking her from behind the walls. She didn't know when her family died, or even if she'd ever leave. When she was finally released in 1795, she stepped out into a Europe that had already replaced her parents with new regimes and new wars. And she never really recovered. She married her cousin, as one does, in that particular gene pool, and spent the rest of her life quietly shuffling between royal courts in exile. She never had children. She barely spoke of her past, but every so often people whispered about her. Some claimed she'd been swapped with another girl in prison, and that the real princess had died. Another legend born from royal paranoia. What's certain is that she spent the rest of her long, gray life haunted by the ghosts of Versailles, a walking reminder that revolutions may kill kings, but they leave survivors too broken to celebrate. Charles I's children, the royal family that wouldn't stay dead. If we move back to England for a moment, we meet another set of unfortunate royal offspring, the children of Charles III Charles, famously executed in 1649 after the English Civil War, left behind 9 children, and their fates were a kind of slow-motion tragedy that unfolded over decades. His eldest son became Charles II. The merry monarch, though merry, mostly meant womanizing his way through political chaos. His younger son, James, eventually became James II, who promptly lost the throne in the Glorious Revolution. But the younger children? That's where things get darker. 2 of his daughters died in captivity. One, Princess Elizabeth, died at age 15, imprisoned in the Isle of Wight. When her body was found, she had been holding a small Bible that her father had given her before his death. A tidy symbol, if an unbearably sad one. Another, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was taken prisoner at age 8 and spent his youth shuffled between captors. He survived the war only to die of smallpox soon after being reunited with his family. The surviving siblings spent years in exile, scattered across Europe, depending on the generosity of cousins and foreign monarchs who didn't particularly want them. The Restoration in 1660 brought some of them home, but the family was never whole again. Even when Charles II returned to the throne, it was under the heavy shadow of his father's execution. A sort of uneasy truce between monarchy and memory. For all the paintings of laughing courtiers and mistresses, there was always that ghost of a severed king behind them. Their early marriage was famously unconsummated for years, because he was both anxious and anatomically unmotivated. So Marie, isolated in a hostile court and barely out of puberty, coped the way many teens do. She shopped, and while her spending habits were indeed excessive, so was the pressure. The entire nation wanted her to produce an heir. She just wanted to go home. Tsarevich Alexei, the Fragile Hope. Then there's Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian Empire, born in 1904, beloved, frail, and doomed. From birth, he suffered from hemophilia, a genetic gift from his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. A small bruise could mean internal bleeding. A fall could mean death. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, lived in constant panic. The court whispered that the heir might not survive childhood, and in their desperation, they turned to mystics, most famously Grigory Rasputin, the bearded confidence man we met earlier. And so the pattern repeats. The children of executed royals became either political hostages, tragic recluses, or forgotten footnotes. We like to imagine royal blood as protection, something that wraps you in luxury and power. But more often than not, it was the opposite. Royal birth made you too valuable to ignore, and too dangerous to let live. Let's drift to our next chapter, quieter, colder, and far more continental, where imperial children carried their parents' downfall into exile.